The most dangerous weapon in Gaza right now is not a missile or a bomb. It is a locked door, a sealed crossing, a form that cannot be approved. Because when food, medicine, and shelter are kept out, people don't just suffer, they disappear. And that is why the warning that came this week mattered. It did not come from activists in the streets or protesters with banners. It came from inside the European Union itself, from a commissioner whose job exists for moments like this, when policy becomes survival and law becomes the last line between life and death. Hadja Lahbib looked at what was happening in Gaza and said something governments rarely say out loud. Blocking charities is not administration, it is starvation. Blocking aid is not regulation, it is violence. She said it clearly. If Israel blocks international humanitarian organizations from operating in Gaza, it is blocking life-saving assistance. Not paperwork, not politics, not technical cooperation, but food, medicine, shelter, and clean water. The things people need to survive another night. And she reminded the world that international humanitarian law does not treat this as a gray area. It is explicit. Aid must reach those in need. Yet even after a ceasefire was announced in October, Gaza remains sealed. Crossings are still largely closed. Mobile homes for displaced families are stopped. Reconstruction materials are blocked. Humanitarian convoys wait while people inside run out of everything. More than 2 million human beings remain trapped in a space where almost nothing enters and almost no one leaves. This is not an accident. It is a system where suffering becomes leverage, where access becomes control, and where survival becomes conditional. And this is why Lahbib's warning matters, because she did not say, "This is unfortunate." She said, "It is unacceptable." She said the NGO registration law Israel plans to implement cannot stand in its current form because it would prevent humanitarian organizations from functioning. And when humanitarian organizations cannot function, people die. Slowly, quietly, predictably. Since the ceasefire, Palestinian officials say hundreds of people have still been killed, not in major offensives, but through ongoing strikes, delays, and denials that never make headlines. Death by erosion, death by obstruction, death by waiting. The language of war is loud, but the language of humanitarian collapse is quiet. It is the silence of an empty clinic, the stillness of a food warehouse that cannot open, the absence of medicine that should have arrived, the child who does not die in a bombing, but in a hospital bed that never received supplies. This is why blocking aid is not neutral. It is a choice. It is a political decision that produces physical consequences, and those consequences have names, faces, and families. This moment reveals something deeply uncomfortable. Humanitarian access itself has become a battlefield, not fought with bombs but with laws, restrictions, and bureaucratic gates. A battlefield where control is exerted not over territory but over survival. And that is why this is no longer only about Israel and Gaza. It is about whether the world still agrees that civilians should not be used as pressure points. It is about whether humanitarian law still has authority, or whether it exists only when it is convenient. It is about whether aid is a right or a privilege granted by power. Because when food becomes conditional, hunger becomes political. When medicine becomes restricted, illness becomes weaponized. When shelter becomes blocked, displacement becomes permanent. And when survival itself becomes subject to approval, dignity disappears. The EU Commissioner's warning is not a threat and not a condemnation. It is a reminder of a boundary the world promised never to cross again. A boundary drawn after other wars, other famines, and other blockades taught humanity what happens when access is denied. That boundary is simple. You do not starve civilians. You do not block aid. You do not turn humanitarian law into a bargaining chip. And when those lines are crossed, the world must not whisper. It must speak, because if even humanitarian access becomes negotiable, then nothing is protected. Not children, not hospitals, not life itself. And that is the true danger in Gaza today. Not only the bombs, but the doors that remain closed after the bombs stop.